Well, welcome to the last session of the 18th Annual Transforming the Teaching and Learning Environment virtual conference. Just like I've been for the previous sessions, I'm Bob Hales and I'm your moderator. Don't forget our sponsor this year is the Journal of Educators Online, JEO. They have a wide selection of refereed articles. I bet you can find something that will pique your interest there, and you may want to submit an article. Just go to thejeo.com. We have with us Fern Faith Watson. As you can see, she's the director of the Faculty Development Center at Murray State University. See, Murray State, is that the racers? All
Yes,
right,
I am
yeah.
impressed.
Okay. And as you can see, she's going to talk about a blueprint for designing a lesson using active learning techniques. From Faith, it is all yours.
Thank you very much, Bob. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I do not take it for granted that you took time out of your schedule to join us today. And as you can see, the session title is A Blueprint for Designing a Lesson Using Active Learning Techniques. Now I'm going to jump over to the next slide. And in the spirit of active learning, I want to start out with this Mentimeter for you. You can decide to go to mentimeter.com, use code 71170844, or you could just use the QR code on the screen. What comes to mind when you think about active learning? All right. Now, you just enter the code. All right, so typical answers are like engagement, all right. I'm gonna talk more about Mentimeter later on as we talk about tools that we can use to get you more engaged in active learning. All right, so. All right. Now in this session, we are going to be looking at what is active learning. How do I design a lesson using Gagne's events of instruction? How could I make each event of instruction more active for face-to-face or online? What questions do I still have to design my active learning lesson? And so we're going to be looking at different technologies as well as we go along the way. So what is active learning? So active learning consists of short course related individual or small group activities that all students in a class are called upon to do, alternating with instructor-led intervals in which students' responses and process, in which students' response are processed and new information is presented. Here's another way to look at it. Active learning is where students are doing, discussing, and applying concepts. And it leads to better retention, deeper understanding, and higher student satisfaction. And you can see the sources here for the quotes. Now, imagine that you're teaching a class on environmental science, and your objective is for students to explain the causes and effects of climate change. In a traditional lecture, you might explain the concepts, show some slides, and maybe ask a few questions. But in an active learning situation that is a little bit more active, what do you think? What are some things you think the instructor could do? You could put your answer in the chat if you feel comfortable with that. Experiential activities for the students, yes. Yes, that is definitely all right. Field trip. Mm-hmm. All right. Presentation. All right. So let's see here. So in an active learning approach, you could facilitate activities such as think, peer, share. Now, this is a very popular one, which I believe most of you would know, where you ask the students to think individually about the question. For example, what are 3 factors that contribute to climate change? And you allow them to discuss their thoughts with their partner and then share back with the class after the time that you have allotted. You have case studies where you provide real world scenarios such as a city facing rising sea levels and ask students to analyze the cause and propose solution. Now, when you hear me discussing or proposing these examples, they might seem like, oh, well, anyone could do that or think of that, but you'd be surprised to see what people default to. Not a lot of educators default to these things, even though in some cases we know of them. So this is just a reminder. Of course, you have polling. You can use a tool like Mentimeter to ask a multiple choice question or a poll. So for example, the Mentimeter that I had put up earlier, and people who contributed to it, I'm seeing words like motivation, critical thinking, engagement, collaboration, activity, application, retention, interactive, involvement, active learning. You know, there are different things that people placed in it, and it was in the form of a word cloud. Okay. All right. So another way the instructor could set up, you could actually use Mentimeter to set up. I'm not going to ask you to do this, but I'm just showing you, you know, of another way in which the instructor could set this up about the primary cause of the greenhouse effect. But if you want to see what that looks like in Mentimeter, this is what the students would come up with when they put in the relevant information to access it. And they would just put their information in and submit it. All right, so let's get back to where we were. These are some other active learning strategies. I mentioned think, peer, share, but of course, and I mentioned case study polling, but you have the muddiest point, where students will share the things that they needed more clarification on. And of course, you have the minute paper. You could do this at the end of the class where students can use it to summarize the things that stood out to them in the lesson. And of course, student-centered discussion. All right, and student-centered discussion is the discussion where we as educators, we are not the ones that are dominating the discussion, but we're asking students to interact with each other, which takes me to this. Facilitating student-centered discussion is another way whereby these are conversations where students are doing the heavy lifting, asking questions, challenging ideas, and building on each other's thoughts. Right? So imagine someone in your class saying something and another student is respectfully challenging their ideas. That is very different from you dominating the discussion. One effective strategy is the Socratic seminar, where you have posed an open-ended question related to the topic. For example, was the American Revolution inevitable, or could it have been avoided? That's a question. Then give students time to prepare their thoughts. This is very important. And then facilitate the discussion by encouraging students to respond to each other. Of course, not just you. And then you have the fishbowl discussion, where a small group of students discusses a topic while the rest of the class observes and then provide feedback. So a facilitator may do the following: ask a question such as, what's one challenge you have faced? What's one challenge you have faced when trying to, you can fill in the blank, right? And how might you address it? Ask students to take 2 minutes to discuss the question with a partner or type their thoughts in the chat, especially if it's online, okay? Allow students to share. So you might say, now let's hear a few responses. So the key takeaway here is to create a space where students feel safe to share their ideas and where you, as the instructor, guide rather than dominate the discussion. Now, here is what it could look like in Padlet if you were using this technology to do it. And you're asking students, what's the biggest challenge with online student engagement? So I have here, you can literally see, of course, you can use the QR code and go in and add your comment if you want, but I have this slide here showing what it would look like. So students, if you use the QR code, you could access these questions and click on the plus sign at the bottom of each and just add your response. So that's another way where, as the facilitator, we can quickly gather students' thoughts, all right? So if you wanna participate, go ahead, or if you wanna put your answer in the chat, I'm giving you options today. All right. Moving on. If you need time to think about your answers, you could definitely put it in the chat and I will look at it. But the main point here is to show you how these things can help you to make your lesson active. All right, so here are some tools that you can use to support active learning. And later on, we're going to talk about how you can use different tools, especially when we're talking about the events of instruction that we're going to be getting to soon. Let me see here. So Bob says, getting everyone involved. Yes, definitely. Now I have some tools here on the screen. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with any of these. I would like to allow you, you can put in the chat. I don't want to put anyone on the spot here if you don't want to unmute, but if you want to unmute, please go ahead. But for these tools here, of course, I just showed you Padlet and Mentimeter when we started. Now we have others like H5P, Toonly, ThingLink, Powtoon. let me show you some others. And you can tell me if any of these stand out to you or if you have used any or if you're familiar with any of these. So you have Adobe Spark for social graphic, you have Animoto, VideoAnt, several here. Do you have any that stands out to you or perhaps even any that you have used that you'd like to highlight? I'll give you a moment to either put your comments in the chat or unmute and share. And I'll just show you one of them quickly as well. Have you used any of these? Mentimeter, Padlet, H5P, Toonly? Okay, so one person says she has used Padlet. Another person said I've used Padlet. I've heard of a few others. Yeah. All right, so let me share with you. This is H5P. At my university, we use Canvas. And so the video management platform that we use is Canvas Studio. And in Canvas Studio, you can embed quizzes in your video. But H5P, if you're not in an organization that allow you to add quizzes to your video, or you just need another technology, another idea, this is H5P. I'll just show. Let me know if you are hearing this. Are you hearing this? All right, let me start again. So here's a multiple choice question that was added to the video. And the question is, and I want you to answer in the chat, what kind of berry is this? Just for example's sake, right? All right. Okay, it's obvious that it's strawberry. So we'll click strawberry and check. So now imagine if you're teaching and your student, early in the video, they got something that asked them a question. Now they're really looking to see, I better pay attention to this video. All right, highlight the ingredients that have been added so far. You can unmute if you want to unmute, or you could put it in the chat. All right, someone says strawberry and blueberries. All right, you mean no cookies were added, no milk? Are you sure? Is that your final answer? All right. Are you sure? Okay, let's see. So you're saying strawberries and somebody said blueberry. All right. Yay. All right, but you get the point. Obviously your course will have much more serious implications. Okay, so I trust you to come up with, but that's just one of the technologies that we are talking about here to engage. But I have a number of them here. All right. Okay, let's move on. Looking ahead. Let's look ahead here. What challenges do you face with engaging students? How do I design a lesson using Gagne's events of instruction? How could I make each event of instruction more active for face-to-face or online courses? Or what questions do I still have to draft my active learning lesson? All right, so that's what we're doing, looking ahead. All right, so think back to a lesson you have designed before. What worked well in engaging your students? And after that, we're going to look at what would you have done differently to improve participation or interaction. You are free to unmute if you want, but you can also put your answer in the chat. I'll give you a minute to type your answers in the chat and I'll be quiet. And even if you have not designed the lesson per se, it could be that you facilitated a lesson, you taught something. All right, we have what worked well, providing at least one sample. What I would have done differently is ask for different input, maybe a poll the first or second week of the course. Yes, thank you very much for sharing. So it really helps to provide examples to our students. And believe it or not, example really helps to engage our students, because when a student sees an example, it takes away some of the mental pressure or even cognitive load that they have to go through. In addition to, in some cases, some students are stressed about the assignment, but seeing an example takes away some of that pressure and frees up their mind to think critically about what they need to do. So thank you for sharing. All right, so here's another question. If you were designing a lesson, what event of instruction would you include? And I have another question here. Have you heard of Garnier's event of instruction? If so, which of the events do you remember? Or which event of instruction, yours or Garnier's, could lend itself to active learning? You can either go to the Padlet by using the QR code on the screen, or if it's easier, you could put your answer in the chat. I'm being very flexible here today. And this question, have you heard of Garnier's events of instruction? Okay, one person says she hasn't heard of Garnier's events of instruction. Has not. Okay. All right, so let me clarify what we mean by that, because it's gonna be very useful. So here we have Garnier's 9 events of instruction. Now, these 9 events of instruction, they are research based, and they are based on how people learn. So as I go through them, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through them briefly, and then I am going to show you a worksheet that you can use to help your instruction be more active. And it's going to be a combination of the Garnier's events of instruction and other tools that can make each event more active. But first, let's look at each event. So Have you ever seen someone teaching, and let's say they are going to be teaching a formula or an equation? So they could go to the class and they would start, okay, class, we're going to be calculating some equations today. We're going to be doing some equation. Let's get right to it. That would be presenting the content. That would be presenting the content. What about if you wanted to show some examples or non-examples of something? That would be presenting the content. If we're not careful, some instructors will start at event 4, right? Now, but what if the instructor, even though it might seem like a boring formula to students, the instructor might gain the attention of the students? For example, I remember seeing and someone outlined the events of instruction, and they shared where everyone in the house was doing something in the morning. Somebody was using a curling irons to curl their hair. Another person was using the iron to iron. Another person, perhaps a microwave, different things. And all of a sudden, boom, the power went out. The instructor could then ask the class, what just happened? And the student could give different answers to say, well, probably it was overloaded and could not take so many different things. And they could give different answers. Then they were ready for the instructor to give the objective. And then she would tell them that today we're going to learn what's the correct amount that we need to use each time. Then she could stimulate recall of prior learning by saying, recall that the formula for calculating the voltage is ABCD. And then now they're ready for the content. Then she could provide guidance for them to show them how to do it. Illicit practice, you could put students in group to discuss different scenarios in which they need to apply the situation. Then you could bring them back together and provide feedback in terms of what they discussed in the group. And then you can assess performance later on. Now the assess performance is a more high stake activity whereby the students could actually do it alone. A lot of time the high stake activities are individual assignment, but of course you can have group projects, etc. Enhanced retention and transfer is where you are giving them a situation where they need to apply it purposefully in the real world. So let's look carefully at an example. All right, I'm going to close this here and show you one that I have here. Let me increase the screen. So, gain attention. The purpose to gain attention is to capture the learner's interest to prepare them for learning. Remember I said earlier that it's research-based, okay? It's research-based, so. So the instructor might gain the student's attention by saying, how many of you think goldfish have a 3-second memory? All right, and then the active learning strategy that the instructor may use, student may place their answer in a poll. Of course, we showed a couple of technologies today. They may have a peer discussion, allow students to explain their reasoning. Students may raise their hands if the lesson is in person. Of course, the technology in this case could be a quick Zoom poll or Mentimeter. So I'm keeping it very simple. Use what you're comfortable with. As I showed you earlier, there are various technologies that you may use. Then after you have gained the learner's attention, they are ready for the learning objective. And the purpose is to clarify that students will be able to, what students will be able to do by the end of the lesson. For example, share measurable objective. So here is the instructor. Now that you have thought about memory and how we test ideas, let's review the objectives for today. By the end of this session, you will be able to do the following. describe the steps of the scientific method, and apply the scientific method to a real world scenario. And of course, in terms of the active learning strategy, students review the learning objective. Students identify whether or not they are already familiar with doing the objectives. And here the technology is a slide presentation of objective. It could be via PowerPoint, Google Doc, or in this presentation, I'm using Canva. So, all right. The next event is to stimulate recall. And by the way, you don't have to use all 9 events in a lesson. As a matter of fact, when I am working with instructors, I actually have five events that I tend to use, which I could show you later, depending on how much time we have left. All right. But let's go through the 9 events, and then I'll show you how you can condense it to a smaller number depending on your situation. So stimulate recall. And the purpose is to activate existing knowledge to help students to connect to the new content. All right, so that could be a quick quiz, ask students to really recall relevant concept from the previous lesson. So this instructor is saying, think back to a time when you had to solve a problem step by step. How did you approach it? How did you organize your process? All right. The example that I gave earlier with the instructor that was talking about the scenario where the power went out, she could ask the students to think back to a formula that they had calculated in a different class, right? In small group, students may brainstorm or discuss prior problem-solving strategies. Now we get to where some instructors tend to start. Present the content. Deliver new content in an organized way. Example, video, demonstration, chunked explanation, I would say examples, non-examples, etc. So the instructor may say, let's break down the steps of the scientific method. We'll start with the first step, observation. I'll show you a scenario where a question arises and walk through how to observe the problem. And then the active learning strategy over here is use a real world example, a weather pattern or behavior observation, and pause to ask guiding questions after each step. You can have a slide deck with video, visual, and video demonstration if available. I'm gonna pause here and see if you have any questions about this so far, what I've shared. Oh, all right. Okay, it seems as if you're all following. I'm getting something for you to show you. Okay. Can you see how it is important for you to use the events of instruction before you get right into the content for the day? Yeah, because many times that's where we start. And again, the events of instruction are based on how people learn. So, all right. as I promised, I'm going to show you how, after I go through, how you can literally cut down these events of instruction to just make it more manageable for you to do. Because when you see 9 events, you might tend to be a little bit overwhelmed to say, you mean I have to use all 9 events in an instruction? And I'm saying, no, you don't have to. All right, so I'm going to show you that in a moment, but let me just get right back to this lesson plan here. All right. So after you have presented the content, we're going to provide a learning guidance. So you proposed, the purpose is to support understanding with examples and non-example. So it's one thing to present the content, but it's another thing to show them example, right? And it could be where you model a problem solving process or provide annotated examples. So let's work through an example together. The instructor might say, I'll provide a question and we'll break down how to form a hypothesis and create an experiment. We'll collaborate on drafting the hypotheses step by step. All right, and so in terms of the active learning strategy, guide students through the hypothesis building process, asking questions that prompt their critical thinking and connecting it to the scientific method. And of course, you can use whiteboard, digital display you need something to capture their responses or their progress. All right. Does anyone remember what comes next? What comes next? After you have provided the guidance, what could you then do? Let's go back over what we have done so far. We gained their attention, we told them the objective, we stimulated their recall, we gave them the content, we provided the guidance. What do you think we could do next? After you have guided them, what do you think we could do next? All right, so now I am getting you to engage a little bit more. You're thinking. So right now you're more curious about, what's gonna come next? You might remember this part even more than the other part because I ask you. Sometimes it's good to go from the unknown to the known, or to recall, help you to put it in an organized way in your brain. So it's illicit performance, practice. All right. So let learners apply new skills, hands-on activities, simulation, or group discussion. So the instructor might say, now I'd like you to break up into pairs and design your own experiment based on the example we discussed. Use the provided worksheet to draft your hypotheses and experiment steps. All right, so active learning strategy. The students can create their experiment, design, and hypotheses, how they test it, followed by a brief sharing of their work. You can use Google Doc or printed worksheet. All right. You see how this is very different from just coming and lecturing? All right. What comes next? So you have given them the guidance. They have practice. What do you think could come next? Or at some point after they have practice, what do you think could come next? All right, provide feedback. Provide feedback. This is very important. Offer corrective and reinforcing input. Give specific comments on work or facilitate peer feedback. So the instructor may say, let's look at a few of the experiment design you created. How are they testing hypotheses in a measurable way? What can be refined in the experimental setup? Where students present their experiment design in the class for peer review, the teacher and peer give constructive feedback. Alternatively, students could do peer review via a learning management system. So here at my university, we use Canvas, and I often do peer review, let them do peer review in Canvas. And I use a rubric to make that, to help them to do the process. And so that's easier because sometimes if you're giving students work to do, you can let them review each other's work, give them a rubric. So by the time you get it to grade, you have a better version. And the process of them going through and looking at each other's work and grading it, giving others feedback, but they will go back to their work with, with a different set of eyes to look and improve their work, and then you'll have better work to review. All right. So next, what could be next? I wonder what comes next. Well, we have assess performance, and the purpose is to evaluate whether the objectives are met. As I said before, the practice is lower stake, assess performance is higher stake. I remember being at a university, not the one that I am at, but a faculty was having problems with the students. They were complaining. So when I had a conversation with the faculty to get an understanding of what was happening, he said, well, I really wanted to challenge them, give them something novel to do. And while that was good, a good aim, I was saying to him, you know, it was at the beginning of the semester. I said, did you give them any opportunity to practice before you challenge them in such a novel way? He said, no, at all. So you'd be surprised to see that leaving an event out, such as practice, can really cause students to do things. Either they complain, in some cases they cheat because the stake is so high and they have not had the proper guidance that they need. Students should never cheat though. That is no excuse for that. So that's not the point that I'm making. The question then is, how can we make the lessons more conducive to learning that students are able to even enjoy the learning process? All right. Now, the final step is enhance retention and transfer. And the purpose is to help students remember and apply the knowledge long-term. So you want to focus on real-world projects, reflection journal, or space reviews. Now, the instructor can say, now think about a real-world situation. What's something you'd like to experiment with using the scientific method? Discuss in peers and share your thoughts with the class. All right. So this is just an example. I'm going to go over to Canvas now and show you. I do a course design challenge for my faculty, and in that course design challenge, we do a number of things in the challenge. So I'm just going to jump over to the modules, module 4.3, right? But even before I go to module 4.3, let me just give you a big view of the module, because even with the module, I'm using Garnier's events of instruction, but I'm not using all the events. Look at this. I use here to gain their attention, which is the introduction. Then I tell them the objective. Then I provide the content and guidance. In this case, I'm using 2 pages of learning content and guidance. And then I'm giving them an opportunity to practice and then apply. Do you see how I was able to use some of the key events of instruction? And as a matter of fact, in module 4.3, I challenge them to come up with their micro lessons. And I say you can actually even use the micro lesson worksheet or the long version. So I give them the instruction about Garnier's events of instruction, where each event is tied to the mental processes, because it is active. It's already active, but in this session, we are making it even more active. And I actually have an example here where this is where I was telling you about the example earlier with the instructor. So let me see if I could. Yeah, this is the one I was explaining earlier. Given the voltage in a circuit and the wattage of an appliance, find the amperage the appliance will draw using the formula amperage equal watt slash volt. And you see the instructor didn't start here by just doing the calculation. The instructor started with show a scene where everyone is getting ready for work, as I said before, and then boom, and then she stated the objective. All right, she stated the purpose of the lesson, and then she asked the students to recall that the typical voltage in a household is that. So you see how it leads into that. So you can see here that you can be very flexible. You can use a shorter version. So I will say to my faculty, for example, you can just focus on gaining the students' attention, stating the objective, provide the guidance, opportunity to practice and apply. All right? Yeah, so that's how you can use Gagne's events of instruction to help your students to learn. All right, so real quick in review, we looked at what is active learning, how do I design a lesson using Gagne's events of instruction. We looked at how we could make each event of instruction more active. And so I end in the last 3 minutes. What questions do you still have in terms of making your lesson more active? Any questions or comments? Or anything that stood out to you? Perhaps anything that surprised you? Or you are welcome. You are welcome. These events of instruction in my field, I remember when I was doing my graduate studies and we had to design lessons using Gagne's events of instruction. And we did it in those days, it was primarily for face-to-face classes. And I remember speaking with an expert in the field and he said, how would you feel if an instructor comes to a class and just give the students the handout and just disappeared after? How would you feel? Well, he said, why would you want to do that in an online environment? You can't just put a bunch of resources there. Why not gain their attention? Then tell them the objective, use Gagne. And so that is also an inspiration for me to use Gagne even to design the online instruction. And I use it whether or not I am meeting with people face-to-face, because then even if they missed a class, they can go through the events, my objectives, and everything else that they need to do. With that, I want to thank you all for attending this session, and I'm glad that it was helpful to you.
Yes, it was. I certainly appreciate you taking the time to do this. And it was a very good session to end the conference on. So doubly good. And I want to say I appreciate our attendees. They've been to many of our sessions, and I hope to see them next year, assuming I'm around, which I plan to be, but who knows? At any rate, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And you have a good rest of the day, and everybody else take the rest of the day off.
Thank you very much for providing this conference. You are doing good work.
Thank you.
Yes.